this first one is the core paper, let's say, of this project that tries to answer the central research question that we wanted to address in this larger scale endeavor, and it's about the social background effects on cognitive effort. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors. It has been a collaborative endeavor over the years with many people contributing to the project. Not all are listed here, but many, and most of the co-authors are in the room today, which is great, including William, Lea was here yesterday, Heike and Jan and Madeline. Also Paula Apascaratei and Alberto Palacios have been part of this. Okay, so let's get into it. We have been talking already a bit conceptually about how should we think about effort, and in the psychological literature, which we follow in this basic sense, effort is mostly referred to as the engagement of executive function, as Jennifer already explained us this morning. So it means using the basic functions of our brain to direct our attention and effort to a particular task, basically deactivating the automaticity of our normal cognitive processing. So if we're just daydreaming or going about our business, that normally involves little cognitive effort. And what is very clear from existing evidence is that overall cognitive effort is an aversive process. So it means we on average we seem to dislike it, and because we are drawing on a finite resource that is our mental energies, if you want to say so. So one of the dominant theoretical approaches to this speaks about the opportunity costs of effort. So if we choose to engage with a certain task, we are using up some of the bandwidth that we have available, and that means also we kind of preclude ourselves from using our attention and mental resources for other things. And maybe even more importantly, to just generally update and scan the environment for dangers or alternative uses of our attention. So we need some kind of incentives to engage with effortful tasks, and those can be intrinsic curiosity, kind of interest in certain things, or can be extrinsic. And these are some of the questions we want to look into a bit more deeply. From a motivation or background perspective, effort is very highly relevant, and in the big normative debates in the social science and philosophy, it is one of the key elements in the debate about meritocracy, where merit has been defined or proposed in this dystopian novel by Michael Young from the 1950s as a setting in which one's merit is purely defined by ability and effort. And and this became kind of over time actually a vision that has a very positive connotation, despite some of the dangers to that concept that Young was pointing out, and I think that in the keynote this morning we also learned about. Then in the more let's say political economy literature, there's a fairly important strand of research in the wake of John Romer's work on equality of opportunity, and there he proposes that as opposed to the circumstances, the structure that we cannot control, the effort that an individual exerts is really the only thing that is fully under her control, and thus this is really the only legitimate driver of inequality that we should accept if we think about social justice from a macro perspective. Okay, so what we started with was this need for knowledge. The effort is a very prominent concept in these different debates that I already mentioned, but we don't really have strong evidence about how it's distributed in the population, and particularly in terms of social stratification, the social origins differences that I mentioned. So this was the first goal, to describe inequality by social background, and then particularly understanding any gradient we might find. To what extent is it driven by incentives? So there's competing ideas about how effort might differ by social background. This is kind of joked about in this little cartoon here. The classic narrative that as sociology students we have been socialized with certainly is that in the working classes there's a very strong routinized work schedules, obviously in early industrialization, very heavy workloads and long working hours, and that kind of brought about a kind of a narrative of a blue-collar work ethic that's very pervasive in the working classes. Whereas the members of the privileged social strata in, let's say, 19th century or early 20th century capitalism would rather not work a lot and actually demonstrate what Veblen has called conspicuous leisure. So they would demonstratively not work a lot because there was a status symbol, the capacity to be lazy or to dedicate oneself to, let's say, unproductive things such as the fine arts, etc. was a way to signal power and status. However, this world is kind of long gone, and now we live in a world where the dominant narrative is rather the opposite. So Markowitz called this the meritocracy trap, where the elites of today, what he calls the meritocrats, rather exhibit a very strong attachment to work, and the people that earn the very highest salaries tend to be the ones that also work very long hours. And at the bottom of society, we often find people that are excluded from productive activities and don't really have many ways to engage in meaningful work, and often then have to deal with the consequences. In the interdisciplinary, mostly economics and social psychology literature, people have also tried to describe this parental SES gradient in effort, or let's say non-cognitive skills, so personality scales that are conceptually close to what we think about as effort. And there there's certainly a positive association in those studies that is pretty robust and not small. However, in order to really measure this properly, we have two basic problems. So one is the very essential insight that if we want to put people to actually do a task and then measure how strongly they engage with it, we have to control for ability. And it's very hard to find a task that is fully ability neutral. But that's certainly the goal. If we want to get at pure effort, we want to neutralize the role of ability. And the other difference, the other problem is, if we wanted to just ask people how hardworking they are, if they're very very lazy, you would get certain answers that may often not fully reflect reality. And we have a study from our early phase in the project where we showed that objective and subjective effort indicators are actually surprisingly weakly associated. So what we propose here is a different approach that tries to overcome some of these limitations and borrows established tasks that have been developed in both behavioral economics and cognitive psychology. So what we use is a large and diverse sample of children in primary school. We focus on the engagement of executive function, the choice to engage, and then the intensity of engaging with these very simple tasks. We also offer the children the choice to play a game instead of doing the task, trying to mirror everyday situations more closely than in some other experimental settings. And as I mentioned, a focus on the role of incentives. So the way we collected the data was originally in the lab, pretty standard. We brought full school classes to the campus of Universidad Carlos III in Getafe here in the south of Madrid, and started collecting these data in this way, whereas in Berlin we could only start the data collection after the pandemic had hit, and this forced us to actually go into the schools. We couldn't access a lab within the time frame we needed to, so we had to kind of adjust and then implement the same design as closely as possible in the actual classrooms. So what we're having is a school-based sample of 5th graders. So these are mostly aged 10, 11, and this sample was selected as a random sample, stratified by neighborhood income and school type. To the extent to which, both in Madrid and in Berlin, there's different educational system, and we took account of those. And you get some impressions here of how this looked like. Let's get to our concrete task that I mentioned. Is very useful that Jennifer gave the kind of theoretical backdrop, at least for 2 of them already. So the first one is the slider task. I think Juan used that one in her study presented yesterday. So this is a very standard task in behavioral economics, which focuses on goal maintenance, on updating, on processing speed, where students have to center as many sliders to exactly 50 as they can in an allotted time. So you got to imagine you don't have just 5 sliders, but you got 48 on a screen, and you only got 2 minutes, and you use the mouse to complete that job. And yeah, it's a pretty tedious task, but it's arguably not strongly dependent on any particular abilities, maybe beyond hand-eye coordination and things that would not be heavily dependent on what we think of as cognitive ability. And then, so the Simon task is a task that's similar to the Stroop task that Jennifer was introducing. So it focuses on attentional control and inhibition in the sense that children see a sequence of arrows that pop up on the screen, and each time they see an arrow, they have to press one button if the arrow points left and another button if the arrow points right. And the catch is that the position of these arrows changes each time. And so the fast thinking response, if you have a left pointing arrow that pops up on the right, maybe to press right. And again, they only have a limited amount of time, and they will complete more correct trials if they do it faster. And then we have the AX continuous performance task, and that one is a task that focuses on switching, particularly switching between proactive and reactive control. So it's maybe even more simple in the sense you get a series of letters that pop up on the screen, and you have to press one button if you see the sequence AX, and you have to press another button if you see any other sequence. So let's say BX or AY or GH, whatever. So it is very, very simple, but yeah, it focuses, it forces the subjects to stay on task and remember, okay, so is this the first, is this the second, and so on. But it's not demanding. And then we use the 3 type of incentives condition that we found most relevant. So the first one is one without any rewards, and that tries to get at intrinsic motivation. And then we introduce material incentives, and because these are young kids, we didn't want to offer them straight up cash, but we instead we tell them, okay, so you will gain points over the course of these sessions, and you will collect them, and the more points you have, the better, because afterwards you can convert those points into toys that we brought with us today in this big suitcase, and you know, we don't show them to the kids before. We don't want them to know exactly what toys they are, but you know, so they get very rallied up. And then we have a final condition which adds status incentives. So now, on top of these points that they will still gain individually, we run a tournament, and we want to find out who are the 3 best performing kids in the group, which is the group they they also interact with in their everyday school life. And so the winners get, on top of the points that everybody gets, they get a diploma and an applause. Okay, so this is the tournament condition. Okay, so this is how the sequence was in more detail. Don't know whether I need to go through everything, but just to maybe to highlight that there was a practice round before each task. So that we made sure that they would understand how the task works. There were validation checks, etc. So in order to rule out later learning effects. And then, as I mentioned, each time then there was a real round starting. So, for instance, here for task 1, then they could choose: do I want to do the task that I was now given, or do I want to play one of the 2 games that I also had a chance to get to know before? Very simple games, but you know, not the task. And yeah, and this was then the situation each time. They would do each task condition combination for 2 rounds. And so in total, they would complete 10 of those rounds, because for the piece rate condition, they would do all the 3 tasks. Which task was 1, 2, and 3 was counterbalanced across the sessions. Okay, so there wasn't the same in each case. But the order of the incentive condition was always the same. It was first the intrinsic, then the piece rate, so the material incentives only, and at the end the tournament, because we wanted to avoid crowding out effects that are very well established in the literature. If we wanted to, if we had kind of first introduced incentives and then taken them away, that would not allow us to really get at the intrinsic motivation that we were interested in. Okay, so the results I'm going to show to you now are based on an analytical sample of 1,152 kids, more in Madrid than in Berlin. That was partly by design, because we knew we would run into some timing issues at the end. But yeah, there was also unfortunately a bit more missingness and similar issues in Berlin. So that's why it's unfortunately a bit unbalanced. And then we look at 2 different dependent variables. So the first one is just simply the choice between doing the task and doing the game in each of those instances. And then the second one is conditional on choosing the task, what number of correct trials did they complete, and that we standardize within each task. And we always control for IQ, as I mentioned. It's very important to take account for that. So in the end, we wind up with, as I mentioned, a hierarchical data set with 10 observations by subject, and use those as a multi-level setup. Our independent variables for the social origin, we have 3 SES indicators. So tertiary education of the parents, yes, no, at least one of the parents has a tertiary education degree. One of the parents has a higher social class position. What's the salariat in the Erickson-Goldthorpe model, and a third one, a continuous indicator of occupational socioeconomic status. Then, as I mentioned, the control variables are important, particularly fluid intelligence, but we also control for the frequency of them using a computer in their normal life, for the frequency of playing video games, but then also for basic social demographics. And then in further model specification, we look at the role of personality scales as well. And at the school level, we control for neighborhood income and school types in subsequent models. Okay, so just descriptively, how did this look like? I told you at first they were doing this in intrinsic conditions, so they had just had the free choice between playing and tasking without stakes, and basically, yeah, half of the kids would tend to play a game, and half of the kids would tend to do the task. But once we introduce the incentives, this percentage of taskers goes up to almost 100%. So as I mentioned, the kids were very motivated by the promise of the toys. So from that point on, this leisure task, the opportunity cost there doesn't really play a big role anymore. Here you can see the percentage of taskers versus gamers in the intrinsic condition that I just showed you. The overall was half-half. You see there's a slight positive effect of tertiary education, of occupational status of the parents, and of social class on the percentage of kids who would do the task instead of the game, but these are not huge effects. If we break it down by the different tasks we use, we see, overall the relationship is similar in the sense that the effort increases obviously as we introduce more incentives. So also the tournament adds another element here where there's another uptick in performance. And what we see is a positive SES gradient. So kind of as we expected by the conventional wisdom on SES differences in non-cognitive skills. All right, let's get to the multivariate results. So now our preferred specification controls, as I mentioned, for IQ, for video gaming, and for mouse use. And these are on the left, obviously, you have the average SES effect across the different rounds and conditions for our 3 SES indicators with the different colors, okay? And so you see, if we only look at the decision to task by SES, there's only a positive effect on average if looking at SES through the lens of social class. And we see this is really driven by the intrinsic condition, and also here, as we saw in the descriptors already, there's a slight difference, but it's not huge, and the interaction, so the difference in the SES gradient across incentives condition is only significant for the social class indicator. Okay, now it gets a bit more juicy because we get into the effort intensity. So how many correct trials would they complete under these different circumstances? And we see here a clear positive effect of up to 1/4 of a standard deviation across our conditions for the different SES indicators. And again, this effect is larger in the intrinsic condition. This is now excluding the gamers, okay? This is only looking at the kids who are actually doing the task. And so we see once we introduce incentives, if we introduce a monetary incentive, and then on top of that a status incentives, the gap between the high and the low SES kids becomes smaller, significantly so. Okay, this is doing the same, but now for different model specifications. Okay, as I mentioned, if we also throw in social demographics and personality traits, and then also for the last 2 here, the blue and the pink estimates would reflect if we wanted to also control for school level characteristics. It's not really obvious why one would do that, because our main question is really about, let's say, the average differences in the population between high and low SES kids. But if you wanted to ask, for instance, like within a given school, would the high SES kids still outwork the low SES kids? The question is yes, although by a little less. That's kind of what this slight downward shaping pattern here suggests. But otherwise, the results, as you see, are fairly robust across model specifications. This is, as I mentioned, data from 2 European capitals. So it's also important to find out whether it's robust if we compare the 2, or whether there's kind of insightful country differences. And there are country differences in the kind of the greater details, but on this average level, we don't see strong differences between the Spanish and the German samples here. Kind of similar patterns. Okay, so this is new. Another way to look at this is, instead of looking at the correct trials, we also had a different part of the project, which Patricia will talk about in a later session today in greater detail, where we use pupillometry in order to measure cognitive effort, arguably in the most objective way possible. And there we have smaller samples, but if we look at the pupil dilation, so the expansion of the pupil diameter according to the engagement with the task, we find also a positive gradient in SES, arguably bolstering the robustness of the results. We had another research question we wanted to address that is about the transmission across the generations. So given now that we have established, okay, there's a slight but robust positive effect of parental SES on children's cognitive effort, can that be explained by a direct transmission of a higher disposition to exert cognitive effort by higher SES parents to their children? So we ran an online experiment during the pandemic where we invited the parents of participating students to take part in this incentivized experiment, which was kind of a reduced form version of our general experiment. So they were doing 2 of our 3 tasks, the Simon and the AX task, and they were only doing it in the piece rate condition. So we didn't have an intrinsic. We obviously didn't have a tournament because each parent would log on at their own convenience. And we managed to recruit over 200 participating parents from our 1,100 kids. So not such a bad response rate overall, although that was higher in Madrid than in Berlin. Even though we adjusted the incentives to the wage levels somewhat, but unfortunately we have a very balanced sample in Madrid. Actually, if we compare the distributions to the general sample in Madrid, but we do have a positive self-selection of the parents into this online parental sample for Berlin. And this is the results. So the outcome is the effort of the child, and we're interested in understanding the relative influence of parental SES as we have before, but now also we can compare that in contrast with the effect of parental effort. So how much of a correlation is there really? And so we see that really in both in most of the SES indicators here, we see a pretty clear positive effect of both SES and parental effort on child's effort, and this is independent of each other. As you see in these kind of the 2 specifications, one is if you put in only one of the variables, and the other one is if you put both of them together, and as you see there's no real shift here, and this is not an interactive effect. We haven't plotted that here, but if we were, so the interaction between the 2 is not significant. So it seems like parents do transmit their effort to some extent, but this transmission would be independent of the SES. There's obviously also hardworking parents with low SES. Okay, so to conclude, effort is positively associated with parental social background, and this gradient is largest when there's no incentives in place. But we want to highlight that the magnitude really of these effects is smaller than we would have concluded from reading the established literature that uses largely self-reported personality scales. So yeah, it's maybe half or a bit more than half of what is commonly reported. So yeah, as you saw, our estimates kind of converged around a tenth or the seventh of a standard deviation. And yeah, as I mentioned, some portion of that effort is directly transmitted from parents to children, but independently of parental SES. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I had a question around the sort of social stratification that you were looking at, because the literature tends to show that middle-class parents tend to be outliers in terms of sort of their children's performance, and it tends to be sort of kids of middle-class parents that perform very well in school as opposed to people with very high incomes or very low incomes. And I kind of wondered how you see this work fitting in with that literature.
that's an interesting thought. We hadn't really thought about it that way. I mean, middle class is not a concept we use in sociology, but you could certainly postulate a nonlinear effect of SES, and I guess we haven't fully contemplated that possibility, and should probably check it out. So I guess that would be easiest with the ISCI indicator, but yeah, we could try to use the social class, individual class differences in a more detailed way, although we will inevitably run into sample size issues there. But yeah, thanks for the idea.
Hi Jonas, thanks very much for the results. Just quick question: do you know anything about the gender differences of your results? Whether there's different between boys and girls? An additional question on that: I think when you talk about parents, are they mainly mothers? And do you know? Can you detect also the intensity of the relationship between the parent and the child? Just for the explanation of the correlation. Thanks.
Yeah, no, these are very good questions. I think we checked the interaction of class and gender, and it was not significant. But I think we should double check because I'm not 100% sure anymore about the first question. The second one, so we use a dominance criterion here for these SES indicators. So basically, if any of the two parents that we have data on reports a higher SES position, we would code the child as high SES, and that is reductive in some sense. It's also standard and a good pragmatic solution. But I think there is a higher share of mothers completing the surveys. There's also obviously, as we know, a tendency where in non-standard families, children would rather live with their mothers than with their biological fathers. So there's that would be a possibility of some of those socioeconomic stratifying dimensions to maybe have some kind of distorting effects on our results that we should probably double check. Thanks a lot.
Hi, thank you. Was extremely interesting, really convincing. Just a short question. Do you have any info on ethnicity or migration background?
Yes, we do. We asked about the place of birth of the responding parent. Unfortunately, since there's a tendency, so if there's mixed partnership, the tendency is that the native parent would fill out the survey. So we think this is underreported here. But we do also ask about language spoken at home. So there's an idea that we have to look into the ethnic stratification dimension using primarily the language question. But yeah, would you have a certain suspicion here how this would level in?
We are working in that direction, and we see higher effort for children of immigrants, which is consistent with the literature on aspiration. So I think it will be really interesting to know with your really objective measure if you also find this premium.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, congrats on this great project. I was just curious if you look into the relationship between IQ and effort and according to different incentive conditions. If you look into that, it would be very curious to know.
Yeah, we did. We did check those interactions. I think Heike had suggested it at the previous instances where we presented it. So and yeah, it could have been interesting avenue to further explore, but yeah, we didn't find kind of triple interactions in the way I think you're suggesting.
Congrats on this. This is great stuff you've been doing. I have a question about the intergenerational part of the project, and I was thinking how you frame the objective of the tasks in the case of parents, whether you say, you reveal the true purpose of the whole project and so on, because I was thinking that maybe higher SES parents might have an additional intrinsic rationale to get involved in the tasks.
Yeah.
because they're generally more interested in what's going on with their kids, and they have more, I don't know, they want to share something additional with them and so on.
Yes.
I don't know whether this is something. And then second, this is something that we've discussed in the past, but now that the project is coming to an end, what would be your take on the physical effort part of this rather than the cognitive, which is something that is never explicit in the project, but whether you now can say something about that.
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, when we designed that part and we had the kind of discussions about it, yeah, most feedback was centered on, okay, so the feedback so the incentive needs to be high enough so that actually high SES parents would also bother to participate in this online thing. And then, yeah, the results we found was the opposite. We have anything a positive gradient. Certainly in Berlin, in Madrid, ever so slightly so, but so I think that's what you mean. No, you didn't mean in terms of like within the participants whether there would be. Okay. Yeah, that's that could be I guess. Although I mean, yeah. So if you're low SES kids and you're only doing it for the money, then I guess you would even, you know, now that you already clicked on it, now you want to do it well, right? So yeah, I'm not sure whether that would be theoretically so convincing, but yeah, it was cannot rule it out. About the other part, no. So we still haven't really done anything about physical effort, and I'm not exactly sure. I mean, as I think replied to you in previous occasions, there, you know, since we're interested in effort from a attainment perspective, from a social inequality perspective, I don't think physical effort has the same relevance for social stratification. I mean, if you want to talk about health behaviors, I think that may be a different thing, but I'm not sure whether doing like a physical exercise would be the way to go. We did collect, as I mentioned, some physiological measures. We also have a subsample where we collected heart rate data, but yeah, it's not. I mean, it's while doing a cognitive task.
All right, thank you all again for being here with us today on our featured session. I'm Madeline Swarr, and I am a research associate here with the Effort Project. And so yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and share with you one of the dimensions of our research project into psychosocial differences in cognitive effort amongst children, which is the gender dimension, so as previously asked about. In our paper with our co-author and former team member, Paula Apascaratei, we show that it is material incentives that drive the gender differences we see according to our effort. Okay, so when we talk about gender inequality in education, in most modern developed economies, we're actually talking about the ways in which girls and women are outperforming or ahead of boys and men. So maybe a perhaps unexpected trend that's not getting talked about enough that has emerged in the last half century. So you can see here that girls are achieving, at least in terms of bachelor's degrees, at a much greater rate than boys across pretty much all of these OECD countries. Of course, this conclusion isn't consistent across all educational indicators, nor has it translated completely into a reversal of the gender wage gap. So part of this reversal, of course, is due to the fact that structural barriers for women in accessing education and jobs have been lowered through many political, economic, sociocultural changes that have happened. But this begs the question that if equality of opportunity has drastically increased between the genders, to what extent are the inequalities and outcomes that we are observing today by gender a result of greater effort by one or the other, assuming ability is equal? It's a whole different and this will help us illuminate the meritocracy discussion that we've so well brought up yesterday. So thus our first research question becomes, is there a gender difference in cognitive effort? And if so, to what extent? Furthermore, to understand gender inequalities and outcomes from an effort perspective, we want to test how boys and girls modulate their effort in response to certain incentives. So that's our research question. Our second research question becomes, how does the gender gap change with the addition of monetary and status incentives? And this will, and this may help us further illuminate the gender gaps that then emerge over the course of the life. All right, perfect. So luckily, Jonas has already described to us a bit about the study. What I'm looking at is, or what we're looking at in this paper is in Madrid. This is a study that had started pre-pandemic when we got cut short, and we then extended our sample after the pandemic to 806 students, 802 of which have self-reported their gender. About 52% are here self-reported girls, 48% boys. So again, we have a 10 observations per student, as described previously in the structure that Jonas had laid out. 2 of these rounds are performed under no incentives, 6 under monetary incentives, and then 2 more under an additional status incentive. And our dependent variable here is the number of correct responses per round, standardized within task to put them all on the same scale. And when we refer to real effort, we're always referring to the standardized score controlled for ability. So these controls include fluid intelligence, mouse use, and video game. I should note, we also, this will come up in a bit, but before every round, we have the decision to task or to game. Students understand that if they if they game, they're awarded 0 points for that round. So this gets factored into our dependent variable here. And the kind of first principle result is this. So this is our real effort model, looking at how first of all, what the gender gap looks like, and then how it changes over the course of different incentives. And what we see here is in the no incentive condition, there is no real difference in effort, real effort by gender. Adding a monetary incentive is where we see this gender gap open up, with boys exerting more effort than girls. You can see an increase in this gender effect with the addition of the status incentive. This is not significant, however, which is something that is surprising given sort of the consensus in the literature that girls are a bit more averse to competition and shy away and underperform in these contexts. So our definition of real effort in the study attempts to measure executive functioning, or effort as we call it, in a composite way, through an aggregate measure of 1, the decision to complete the task, what we might call direction of effort, and 2, contingent upon tasking, then the individual's performance or intensity of effort controlled for ability. So therefore, we are curious, if we break this down, this kind of composite measure down into its various components, do gender gaps look different depending on the effort dimension of interest and how we are measuring it? So the first dimension we look at captures this idea that there is an opportunity cost to effort through the decision of gaming or tasking. And of course, we saw previously most gaming we see happens in the no incentive condition, where almost over a majority of tasks are gamed. So this is an interesting facet to examine, given that part of inhibitory control, as Jennifer has already explained to us, is self-control, or the power to keep at something even though we'd rather be doing something else. This game was appealing to the kids. The task was quite boring. So trying to model that, and for us it kind of is a bit more applicable to the school setting, given that every day students are faced with a decision to complete their homework, to go to school. Okay. So again, a similar model. This is the linear probability of completing the task in a round instead of gaming. Here is what we actually, so we see girls on average, over all incentives, they complete the task more than boys. Most of this effect coming in the no incentive condition. This is about a 4% difference between boys and girls. It's significant. We do additionally control for an array of personality traits, which I don't have time to get into, but include big 5 personality, delay of gratification, risk traits, and with some significant correlations in this sense, but no real mediation of this gender effect. All right, so perhaps outcomes we observe are highly dependent on the structure of the task at hand and what strategies test takers choose to employ. The main trade-off in these tasks being between speed and accuracy. Grissom and Ray has asked the question of whether differences in strategy represent differences in outcome preference rather than maybe differences in effort. For example, if a student's goals are not necessarily aligned with achieving the optimum performance, but maybe avoiding wrong answers, something you see on multiple choice tests a lot. They might not go fast enough to finish a test, therefore really not actually, difference in strategy can lead to different outcomes. And this brings up a question maybe we can talk about at the end, that if certain strategies lead to better performance, doesn't necessarily mean it's more effortful. So what we see here, we're breaking down for the 2 tasks we have this information on, and of course always when the task was completed, the AX and the Simon task. We see that boys are really getting their advantage through reaction time. There's actually no significant difference in error rates between the 2 genders, between boys and girls. So moving on, we're going to zoom even closer in on another dimension, looking at just the AX task. Under dual mechanisms of cognitive control, this framework presented by Todd Braver and his colleagues, on the fact that there's sort of 2 facets of cognitive control, proactive and reactive control. I'm not a cognitive psychologist, so please, if anyone wants to chime in here, I'll try to give you an example. So with the AX test, you're presented a sequence of 2 letters. Proactive control would look like this. The first letter you see is a B. Remember, you're looking for an AX. As soon as you see the B, you know that when the next probe comes, it's not going to be an AX. You already know that. You're applying information, you're holding information from the past and directing it, biasing your attention towards an effortful event. Reactive control is stimulus-driven decision-making. So, for example, you might see an A first. You know, okay, the next one I should be looking for an X or not. Ignoring the A. Now that you know that, it's a Y. No. But if you're holding A in your brain, it's going to disrupt some of your processing later. So this is called a reactive trial, AY. And what we see here is something quite interesting, where boys here are still going much faster than girls. But this magnitude difference, if you look at just the gap between on the left column, is much smaller for the reactive trials. We also see here that girls, so remember, lower value cues are better. Girls are actually performing better when it comes to reactive accuracy. This is one of the only indicators where we actually see this. And sorry for the tables, this is what we just saw. We see some interesting correlations with personality too. So risk-loving children are less accurate in the reactive conditions. Also on top of this, agreeableness is one of the big 5 components, is highly related to more accuracy on the reactive condition. It does not totally mediate the gender effect, but it's interesting to note that these are characteristics that we tend to gender type a bit. And we do see a bit of a movement between the gender, with the gender coefficient moving from column 3 to column 4. Okay. Finally, I want to point to, so fluid intelligence is something that we control for saying that this is controlling for ability. We see a lot of correlations between fluid intelligence and our effort measures. In a few of these measures too, we actually don't see this correlation between fluid intelligence and reactive control is one of them. Some food for thought. So basically, our main findings according to our effort measure is that there's evidence that boys are exerting more cognitive effort, particularly when monetary incentives are in place. This is when boys are also choosing to do the task more, maybe indicating a higher cost of effort for boys as well. But there's no additional increase in this gender gap when status incentives are in place, which kind of goes against what we might have hypothesized about girls' aversion to competition. And differences exist when looking at different types of effort. So this sort of exercise, I think, has very practical implications in that the evaluation systems we engage with, especially in schooling systems, vary greatly in how and what they measure. So if we think about, for example, the difference between final class grades, or something we call GPA, grade point average in the US, which measures maybe a range of things like attendance, homework completion, behavior, time over, performance over a long course of time, rule following. And then also what standardized tests measure, on the other hand, which might have to do more with focus, attention, strategy, time management in a very short amount of time. And also thinking about the lack of consistency between these two measures as well. So I think it's important to apply what we're seeing here into the assessments of school evaluation to understand what sorts of effort our exams and performance measures are rewarding, what we value when we make these assessments, and where gender differences in these type of effort might exist. So, thank you.
Thank you. They asked me to sit down because they recorded. I didn't know. So the setup in this session is, as I said, it's a featured session. These slots have 20 minutes in total. So we have 5 more minutes to go for questions. Was the decision of the effort team. Please. So, short questions, short answers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Manuel. That was super interesting. I was just wondering, since the material incentives seem to be so important for the gender differences, I guess this is the reverse question from the previous one, but are there like socioeconomic status differences in the gender differences? So in the sense like, are material more important within certain like socioeconomic groups?
I think, yeah, so that was really a question. We actually haven't looked at that. We haven't looked at, are you talking about like this interaction between gender and, we haven't looked at that. We should. I know that's something we get note from previously, but that's how I understood your question.
Jennifer.
Thank you. Great work. I was just wondering if the status differences didn't emerge over and above effort. Yes, so the status incentive was in addition to the monetary incentive. That's where it doesn't play out.
Yes.
The reason I'm surprised is because I'm just seeing this again in the context of if you think about gender differences in gender type, and I was just wondering whether material incentives are particularly effective for boys when precisely because of their link for status. So it's not an indicator that status doesn't matter, it's that material incentives are feeding a status motive. And it's just making me think of a paper, and I'm sorry I don't have the author because I just saw it on Twitter, but of looking at gender differences in competition, competitiveness, actually reversing once the goal was a more communal goal. Like once women were competing, maybe if you've seen that paper, once women were competing for something to help others. Yeah. So I wonder, is there a way of framing what is the goal, what are the material incentives for? And maybe we'd see different effects.
Yeah, and I think that's something we know as sort of a route for investigation too. They call this pro-social orientation of women, that maybe what's more motivating. And for me, I think it's interesting looking at the intrinsic condition and why girls are maybe more motivated to perform. And something you see too is that it's always in the first round that girls are really tasking versus gaming, and then they drop off and they game more. And why is this? I mean, girls maybe interpret that they should be doing this more for, maybe not for them, but for their teacher or for the researcher who has asked them so kindly to do it. But yeah, we're not really able to distinguish these totally, and I think that would be very, very interesting. That's obviously where a lot of other literature can come into play.
Yeah, maybe for the setup, couldn't it also be that so the boys game more in the first round, right? And then the girls also want to experience what the game is. So couldn't it be curiosity? So either you do it first or you do it second?
They do always like do the games each. They do get both games before, so they know more or less what they are.
Okay.
But yeah.
That's good. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I don't see. Last question. You are the last present.
Thank you. So if merit is ability plus effort, and boys give more effort, then girls must really have more ability. Agree?
So I actually like this question because I think this is why it's important to ask like what is effort you're rewarding, and I think in terms of there's sort of this provocative new Richard Reeves guy who's talking about that the education systems in our schools are really actually structured against boys, and I think in terms of my experience as a teacher is, and my work with young boys and young girls is, yeah, girls have a lot easier time sitting still, paying attention. And these are the things that teachers, especially at a young age, are really kind of maybe, and this is where you see differences too in GPAs and grades. Girls actually are getting better grades, but boys are, and when it comes to standardized testing, actually I think there's still quite a bit of boy advantage in certain classes. So I think you have to ask, what's the structure you're operating in too, right? So maybe girls have more ability in certain aspects. Boys, maybe like what we saw in reaction time, maybe that's an ability thing too. So I think it's important to.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, we are going to continue with this analysis on the effort data, and I'm going to make this presentation in a paper that Jonas Radl and me are writing about the relative age effect on okay. So the effect of the month of birth on cognitive effort. I don't know how familiar you are with the so-called relative age effect or the so-called month of birth effect, but this is this literature based in this empirical finding that students born in certain months over the year perform better at school than the rest. So this finding is mostly the result of the implementation in most educational system of a school entry cutoff date, meaning that if you are born before that date, you belong to a certain school entry cohort, and if you are born after that date, you belong to the next one school entry cohort. For instance, in the Spanish case, the school entry rule establishes that all students are to begin primary education in September of the calendar year that these students turn 6 years old. Okay? In Spain, this rule is strictly applied, so all students have to follow the rule. So there's no possibility to anticipate or delay school entry. Since the school entry rule is defined with the natural year, this means that the school entry cutoff date in Spain is January 1st. So that's the point when discontinuity appears. So let's look at an example, okay? Let's imagine two individuals. Individual A was born at the very end of December of year T, okay? So let's apply the rule. This student is gonna turn 6 years old at the very end of December of year T plus 6. So the student is gonna start primary education in September of that year. And at that point, this student is gonna be 5.67 years old. Individual B was born just a few days apart, but at the other side of the school entry cutoff. They are virtually the same biological age, just a few days apart, but they belong to different school entry cohorts. Why? Because individual B is gonna turn 6 years old at the very beginning of January in year T plus 7. So this student is gonna have to wait until September to start. And at that point, this student is gonna be 6.67 years old at the school entry. So for all the students that are born in Spain in the last days of December, their age is going to be 5.67. For all the students born at the very beginning of January, these students are going to be 6.67 at school entry. 1 year difference that is going to be consequential for attainment, at least in the earliest stages of the educational career. And that's what mostly literature has observed, that younger students within the school entry cohort perform worse at school, have a higher probability of retaking a course, obtain lower test scores in external evaluations, and are more likely to be diagnosed with a learning disorder. And this effect that is very clear at the early stages of the educational career might wear off or not over the life course. And there is some works that have observed this effect, including here in Spain, for final educational attainment. Okay? And since it affects education, you can also observe this month of birth effect for other related outcomes, such as starting salaries, the access to the positions of power in a society, or the dynamics of family formation. This effect is normally referred to as the relative age effect. And I'm going to refer to it either as the relative age effect or the month of birth effect indistinctly. So this is a quite established phenomena, this relative age effect. And there is a recent and growing strand of research that instead of looking at educational attainment, is looking at non-cognitive outcomes, such as personality traits, behavioral skills, emotional well-being, or popularity at the school. And why is this relevant? Because even if this effect on educational outcomes wears off before affecting final educational attainment, it might leave a permanent imprint in other individual traits. Individual traits such as leadership skills, their taste for competition, their risk-taking attitudes, social skills, or the grit and perseverance of individuals. And this is where we want to make a contribution. We want to show whether there is or not a relative age effect on the willingness of students in 5th grade to exert cognitive effort. Okay? So, what's the identification strategy is quite simple, really, because as I just saw, that the idea is that the month of birth, at least for Spain, perfectly determines your age at the school entry, and the age at the school entry is going to affect effort. Why? Well, the explanation that we think more plausible is that effort is differently rewarded depending on the relative age of the student within the school entry cohort. You are a very young student in 1st grade, and you do effort, you are differently rewarded in terms of academic performance. So all the young students within the school entry cohort are going to develop different beliefs about how effort is rewarded, and that is going to influence how they think about effort and how willing they are to exert effort when asked for it. So that could be the identification strategy, and the main assumption here is that the month of birth is exogenous to effort, that there are no confounders, particularly parental SES, that affect both month of birth and effort. And it is reassuring that it has been observed for Spain that unlike some Asian countries, such as Japan or Korea or China, Spanish parents do not see births around the school entry cutoff responding to the system of incentives that is created by the school entry rule. And this means that being observed as the oldest or the youngest student in a school entry cohort is in the end a random event. And we can exploit this randomness to identify that effect on effort. And what are our hypotheses? Well, first, consistently with this research in educational and non-cognitive outcomes, we expect to observe that younger students within the school entry cohort exert lower levels of effort than their older peers. As I said, there has been observed a relative effect on the taste for competition. Older students within the school entry cohort prefer competitive environments. So it might be the case that in this third condition in the experiment that you are already familiar with, this tournament condition, there might be a relative age effect on how much you increase performance between the extrinsic and the tournament condition, because the oldest students within the school entry cohort could have a higher taste for competition. So they could even increase, they could increase further their performance in the effort task. And finally, consistently with more research investigating the heterogeneity of the results by sex and gender, we expect this relative age effect on effort to be larger among boys and low sex individuals. Okay? So to identify these effects, researchers usually follow one of three methodologies. We have implemented the three of them in the paper in order to provide comparable estimates with all existing research. But here I'm gonna only show the results for one of them, for brevity. So the main problem for identification is that in most countries, not in Spain, but in most countries, there is this possibility of anticipating or delaying school entry, which is called green certain or red certain. And that messes with the identification of the effect. In order to address that, most work used an instrumental variable design where the observed age of the student is instrumented with the assigned age. The assigned age is just the age that you should have given your grade and given your month of birth. So it's just a transformation of the month of birth. You isolate the part of the variation in the observed age that is due to the month of birth, and you work with that exogenous variation. The second strategy is to use a reduced form model, where you just regress the effort scores on the assigned age. Again, just a transformation of the month of birth. This is our preferred specification. Or you can just run a regression discontinuity design, fuzzy or sharp, depending on the characteristics of the country. In our case, we do a sharp regression discontinuity design because there is full compliance with the school entry cutoff. And as I said, we are going to use this reduced form model because it's the one that gives us the more statistical power for the heterogeneity analysis. So, moving into the results, you are already familiar with the structure of the experiment. We have the intrinsic condition, the extrinsic condition, and the improvement in scores between the tournament and the extrinsic. So forget about all these markers. Just focus first in the yellow marker in the intrinsic condition. What we observe here is that there is no relevant, there is a non-statistically significant and weak relative age effect under the intrinsic condition. Okay, if we introduce material incentives, then we have a very strong and statistically significant effect. The oldest students within the school entry cohort outperform the youngest students by 2/5 of a standard deviation. Okay. What we did in this different specification is to include variables to investigate further the effect. First, we include as control the sex of the students and the gender to test for possible deviation of exogeneity. And what we observe is that there is a slight increase in the relative age effect, and that's because we have a slight concentration of high sex students in the last months of the born in the last months of the year. And then we include different potential mediators of the effect. First, we include the diagnosis of learning disorders, since being young within the school entry cohort increment the risk of being diagnosed, and that affects performance. We see that 1/10 of a standard deviation of the effect is explained by that. And when we include IQ as a measure of development of the student, we observe a further decrease of the effect. When we do not observe any mediation is when we consider the big 5 personality traits and locus of control, in that the advantage of the oldest students within the school entry cohort does not operate through personality traits. And finally, when we go to the difference between extrinsic and the tournament conditions, we do not see any effect. We hypothesize that any effect would be larger when we move into the tournament condition, but we do not observe that the effort advantage of the oldest students within the school entry cohort increases after inducing competition between the students. And finally, if we go to the heterogeneity analysis, we observe that the effect is indeed larger among males, particularly in the extrinsic condition, where we find the strongest effect. and we also observe that the effect is larger among low-size students. This is suggestive evidence because, well, we do not have enough power to affirm the statistical significance of this difference, but they are consistent with what has been observed for most research investigating the heterogeneity of the relative age. So, summarizing the conclusion, we do not observe any relative age effect on intrinsically motivated cognitive effort, which is a very similar result to the effect of gender. We do observe a very strong rise on cognitive effort under the extrinsic condition, and despite the higher taste of competition of relatively old students, we do not observe a change in the relative age effect after inducing competition. This does not mean that competition does not play a role here. That means that after rewarding performance in the test, inducing further competition is not relevant anymore for the relative age. Maybe without material incentive and with competition, we would have observed an effect. So we consider the results to be relevant because they might explain part of the observed difference regarding the heterogeneity of the results, the highest sensitivity of boys and low-size students to the month of birth can be at least part of the well-established educational inequalities by social origin and gender. And we also propose some policy suggestions regarding how teachers consider in their evaluation, their assessment of students, their relative age, and how we organize a school entry cohort, considering that they are sufficiently homogeneous when we group students that have been born in the same natural year, but maybe it could be a good idea to also to further organize the students into classes, within grades, into classes, according to the quarter of birth, at least in the initial course of primary education. Thank you very much.
Question. Daniel?
Thanks a lot. It's very interesting. I wonder whether you have any data on how long they went to childcare, so pre-primary education, because older children in the same grade tend to differ in one very important thing. That is, when they don't go to school, they stay in childcare typically. So all of this, what you have identified, may be driven by the fact that they spent one more year in the education system, not in the current one, but the previous one, the childcare. I don't know anything about the Spanish childcare, so it might not be true. But in many countries, this is the case that when you don't enter education, you stay in childcare for one additional year. So all that you realize here is that if you are educated more at this age, there are differences.
Well, I don't think I said it. This is data only for the Spanish case. And in Spain, pre-primary education is divided in two levels, 0-3 and 3-6. In the 3-6 level, around 95% of the student body is attending since age 3 pre-primary education. So there is no much variation there. The variation is in the previous state, and you could find something there, but in the end, it happens the same. Even if you go farther back, the idea is that you have also a cutoff date to enter pre-primary education or not. And again, you are grouping students by the natural year, so the thing reappears. I think the effect.
Yeah. So his argument could be correct. One group has 3 years of pre-primary and the other has 2. So it's not a school effect, might be a preschool effect. That was his argument. And given what you answered, that could be the case, maybe. I don't know. So, next question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I was just wondering, can you go back to the last graphs? So, because I think there's like an interesting effect there for public versus private school, but you were fast through it because of time, of course. So I was wondering, so basically in the tournament one, that is the one that you don't find results, you actually see differences by socioeconomic status measured as a school, I guess. And I was wondering whether that says a bit or like speaks to the compensation literature in a way, or if you have any sort of explanation for that.
I did not want, or we did not want to really focus on that finding, because if you look at it, this means that for private schools, the rise is negative. It's the youngest students in the school entry cohort who who benefit more from inducing competition, and that's a strength. So we have some sample restriction here, and even if the finding the difference is statistically significant, it does not seem very. It might be just that we do not have a large enough sample to make any.
Yes, I don't see another. I have one question. Perfect that you have. Maybe I missed. What is the scale of the effect? So is it per month, or is it standardized for one standard deviation?
It's a standardized, and it's the effect of being 1 year older within your school.
1 year.
Yeah,
So that's
it's
the
like
effect
you were
of
born in the first day of the year or the last one.
So then it's not, I mean, it's there, but it's not as large if it would be standardized per month. So 2 questions, you get it, and please be short, but also take it as an idea for your
yeah, this is more like a clarification. I'm not sure, I don't remember the years where you're doing the test, but there's more grade retention by the younger kids in school. So could there be any effect of grade retention?
Grade retention would be a mediator of the effect, because the youngest students within the school entry cohort repeat more often, and that could obviously later affect how willing they are to exert effort. So one of the reasons why we could observe that fifth graders, that the effort of fifth graders depends on the month of birth is precisely because they repeat more. It would be a mechanism. Right?
Yes, but I was also thinking that perhaps there are less of them in the year, because many of them have gone. So you have the younger people that are already at 5th year are the better ones.
But you already have the other one falling from that. So you have some students from 6th grade, so that should be in 5th grade, falling into 5th grade, and you have some missing students from 5th grade that would be in 4th grade.
So the last question, unfortunately, please only raise them, but we have to really move on, otherwise we can't. We have still.
If there's no time, I can speak to you later.
No, but it's great if he gets the question right.
Yeah. Well, one is kind of an observation on all the presentations is the idea that the task of the puzzle, presumably the horse puzzle, was not effortful, because that seems like quite an effortful task, but potentially more engaging and stimulating for particular types of children. And then it links onto my kind of comment for this specifically, which is around birth order considerations, because there's a lot of relationships between birth order and various psychological factors, and I wondered whether you considered how birth order maybe influences some of this data. Thanks.
Short answer.
Well, we have performed the analysis by task. I can show you later. And regarding the second thing, we don't have the information for the birth order, I think, but I think I've read it. This effect is more obvious for the first child in families, because when you are a second child, even if you are youngest within your school entry cohort, you have the positive influence of older brothers, so older siblings. So that is a moderator of the effect. So, but we don't have the data.
Okay, yeah, so we're going to continue with the same project, but now we're going to zoom in on specifically the tournament scheme. And within the tournament scheme, what we're particularly interested in is what is the effect of feedback on children's performance. So this is kind of a question that is important in many contexts. Should we tell people, or should we tell, for example, children in the classroom, how they perform relative to others. And so what we want to distinguish is specifically what's the effect of feedback on the average effort, and what's the effect of feedback on individual effort. Okay, so if you tell a child that he or she is doing very well compared to others in the classroom, or if you tell the child that he or she is doing very badly, what is the effect of that on effort? There's a large literature on these feedback effects, in particular on average performance. But the settings vary quite a lot. Okay, so when I'm looking at this literature, I'm new to this literature, it's actually quite difficult to understand what the findings are, because they do vary a lot. And I think the reason why they vary a lot is, of course, because the settings vary a lot. So in particular, whether there's public or private feedback, absolute versus relative reward schemes, whether the groupings are kind of natural, artificial. And so then when you ask how do you identify these feedback effects, I think two of the main strategies are that either people compare pre-assigned groups. For example, the papers I mentioned here, they compare different academic departments, for example, economists against sociologists, or they do random groupings. Okay, so like in a lab, for example, you could create random groups. And I think what's interesting about our setting is that on the one hand, we do have kind of natural groups. We have children in a classroom, so presumably they care about their relative standing to others in the classroom. But at the same time, we have them in a controlled environment. Okay? You can look at the same individuals in different incentive schemes. So we think or at least we want to argue that we have sort of a bit best of both worlds here. Okay? So like groups that we care about, but in a controlled environment so that we can estimate these feedback effects cleanly. There's also literature, of course, on rank effects on individual effort. And that's perhaps even more interesting, but it's also much more difficult to identify. And one thing that we want to focus on today, which is, I think, a major issue in this literature, is rank effects are difficult to distinguish from mean reversion. And there are, of course, quite a few papers that make this point. For example, a nice one is this paper by Jill et al. They explain very nicely what the problem is. I'm going to show it to you in a second. And mean reversion, for example, might explain why those who are at the bottom of the distribution before receiving feedback might actually be exactly those that improve most their effort or their performance. There are different strategies that people might use to address this mean reversion. For example, one strategy is to kind of randomize ranks for people who have the same performance in absolute levels. But if you do that, I mean, that's kind of like a clean strategy, but at the same time, sort of how you assign status, how you assign ranks, of course, matters also how people feel about them. So I will show you what we do instead. Okay, so this is the tournament setup. We have in Madrid, these are larger groups. In Berlin, we split them into 2 groups per class, so they're a bit smaller. You already understand the scheme. We have the piece rate scheme. But then in addition, in this tournament scheme, we have 3 winners per session. They get a diploma, they get a round of applause, so it's kind of very public who has won in these games. There are 2 rounds of 2 minutes, and after the first round, they receive feedback. Okay, so they receive their ranking, and they receive the absolute scores. So they know exactly where they stand. This is on just showing what the average effort levels are in these different incentive schemes. And so you've already seen that they're higher in the piece rate than if they are in the intrinsic scheme. And they're also higher in the tournament than in the piece rate scheme. And so the gap is actually quite large. So just by sort of transforming this into this tournament with a sort of round of applause and with the rankings, you get quite a bit more effort out of these students than you do otherwise, which is kind of maybe interesting for teachers. We also see that the effort increases between round 1 and round 2 of the tournament. We don't see that for the piece rate. And our interpretation here is, of course, that this is because of the feedback. Okay, so after round 1, they receive this feedback on where exactly they stand in the distribution, and we see that effort increases even further in the round after that. So we first want to talk briefly about how we feel about that in a theoretical model. So this is a model of a tournament. In economics, that's actually a relatively large literature. We sort of like to write down utility functions that then tell us how people behave. And so this is a nice setting. This is sort of, there's game theory in there. People have to sort of respond to how others perform and what others do. So if you're an economist, then hopefully you feel very positively about this. If you're not an economist, maybe a bit less. But let me just show you sort of what the key ingredients are. The key idea is that the output E that we have for a player after round one, on the one hand, it's a function of effort, of course, effort X, but it's also a function of chance or luck. Okay, so in the sense of maybe you were a bit distracted by whatever, or maybe it's sort of when you played some of these tasks, maybe you were a bit unlucky, for example, in how you got these letters and you got a sort of more difficult combination than other students. So the idea is that when we sort of see your output in the end, when we see your score, it's not only effort, of course. There's some extent of randomness in what we see. So then what happens? We sort of play through how people behave in this tournament. And so I think it's kind of nicely summarized here. So what you have on the y-axis is the change or the expected change in effort between round 2 and round 1. Okay, so the notation is a bit weird. This means that round 2 effort depends on your round 2 output depends on your round 1 output, but we want to see sort of how your output changes. And so the orange line is what we would expect with respect to output in round 1 if there's no feedback. And so the slope, the point here is that the slope is negative, and this is, of course, this regression to the mean. That those participants who perform best, some of that will have been by chance, and so you just naturally expect them to revert to some extent to the mean. The blue line is what we get within our tournament scheme if we provide this feedback. And so what you see here is that those who perform best in the first round, they should get this additional boost. And the idea is, the intuition is very simple. If you're close enough to one of these prizes, you receive these rankings, that's an incentive for you to even provide more effort, right? To really try to go for one of these prizes because you're already close, while those who performed very badly, they're already far away enough from the winners that they know that providing more effort is not going to help. So how does this look in the actual data? So I want to first show you that indeed there's also mean reversion in the actual data. So it's not just a sort of esoteric theoretical point. And then I want to show you what seems to be the response to these rank effects once you take into account this reversion to the mean. Okay, so this is from our tournament data. What is the change in output or in the score between round 2 and round 1? We standardize that. And we plot that relative to the score in round 1. And so this is not a scatter plot, this is a bin scatter plot. Okay, so each of these points is the average for individuals who performed in the first round in the neighborhood of this point. And so what you see is, as expected, it's a strong negative relationship. Okay, so those who perform best tend to do worse. And our interpretation is that this is just the mean reversion effect. So what we do next is we simply take out this sort of linear relationship that you see here plotted, so this red line, to try to understand more what is the effect of actual rank relative to this general mean reversion effect. And so we did this separately for the piece rate, where remember there's no feedback here. Okay, so here it's not clear why there should be any rank effects, because there is no feedback. And we do it for the tournament scheme. These again are being scatter plots. And so what you see indeed for the piece rate, as expected, there are no rank effects. Okay, there's no feedback, there are no rank effects. And so once you take out this sort of linear relationship between change in output, change in score, and the rank and the output in the first round, you don't see any systematic relationship. For the tournament scheme, however, now you see the sort of relationship that the theory predicted, which is that those who have the rank 1 here is the one who's at the top of the ladder after round 1. And we see that exactly those people who are close to one of those prizes, indeed, those are the ones who seem to increase their effort most compared to. Okay, but you wouldn't see this if you just look at sort of the relationship between change in effort in the 2 rounds, because the regression to the mean effect is so large. So you might ask if this is statistically significant. So let me just show you briefly the table. So we can sort of either estimate the sort of linear rank effect, that's the red line here, and that's significant, or you could ask what's the effect of being specifically on rank 1, 2, 3, 4. And so we see that at least for these first two ranks, that's statistically significant, and that they increase their effort in the second. Okay, so what are these key results that we have so far? We're still working on it. We do find this, I would say, large boost in effort in the tournament scheme when we have this feedback. Some of that seems to be just the tournament scheme in general, and then there's additional boost from the feedback after round one. And consistent with theoretical implications, we do see that this feedback after round one increases effort most at the top of the distribution. But that's actually relatively hard to detect because these type of rank effects are very easily hidden by mean reversion, which is difficult. Thanks. I think we want to stop here, and we are good on time. Yeah.
Okay, questions? One.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the presentation. So I was just wondering in your result, if you're switching from just ranking into, say, indicators of have won before and almost won, what would you have seen?
An indicator for, sorry?
Say, because right now, I think from what I see from the graph,
Yeah.
you go from rank 1 to 20, right?
Yeah.
But then I guess from your explanation, the top 3 would be the one that wins these grand
Yeah.
applaud. And then you have the one that nearly winners. So I was just wondering what happened to the near winners.
Exactly. So the theory actually tells you that the biggest boost in effort should actually not necessarily be in rank 1. It should be those who are very close to the cutoff point, right? Who are still fighting for the medals. So we would expect that maybe the biggest boost in effort more like in rank 3, 4, 5. You see in the data, we see the biggest boost indeed at the top. Okay, so that's maybe where sort of the theoretical implications, which are very detailed, are then not exactly mapping into what we see in the data.
I don't see another one, but I have one. So in your, because Jonas in the first talk said, you know, it's not, you don't need a lot of ability to do this. So I wonder whether you can see that in these tests, maybe children who usually have lower grades perform well, and how that feedback feeds in. So that goes back to Jennifer's talk. So does it make a difference if I'm a good student and I always have this positive feedback, and then you come with your tests, and or makes it a difference that I'm usually a poor performing student in class, but here I can really win? Does that generate more effort? Because that would also tell us something policy-wise, right? To not only have a tournament about grades, but to have tournaments about everything where students can be good. I guess you haven't looked at it yet.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think we could try to look at that, right? We haven't done that yet. We could distinguish the rank in the actual tournament compared to how they did otherwise in school, for example. And then, yeah, it could go in both ways, right? It could be that, well, if I'm positively surprised, usually I'm the weakest student, now I'm close to the medals, maybe that gives me an extra boost. Or it could be the other way around. If usually I'm a strong student, now I seem to be doing badly, and I don't accept that, and
I don't accept it, or right. I don't care, right?
Yeah.
Anecdotally, what we often saw in the tournaments was that the teachers were often surprised, not only the best students.
Okay, so that might be. So that might be part of the story, right? Yeah. Antonio, last question.
I remember when I went to the US, and so people my generation went to the US, one of the things that were surprised us most is that in the US classrooms, there's prizes for everything. Literally, as you said, there is the best kid in this, in that, and the other, and we said, this is we thought it is ridiculous, but now they do a bit more of this in Spain, which means we maybe are advancing to the frontiers. I think it's a very good.
We should have more diplomas and laws and exactly. Yeah.
Okay, then last but not least, William. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. So last session, and so I guess for most of the presentations in this featured session, apart from Jan's one, it's kind of been about differences between groups in terms of the effort that they exert. What we're going to look at now in this last one is sort of addressing, okay, why might those differences be there? What environmental factors might lead to these differences? And in particular, what we're going to look at is the role of parenting. So we know, as Jonas said, that effort is aversive, right? The human organism naturally wants to minimize the use of scarce cognitive resources. Nonetheless, we also know from quite a bit of work that effort people can be sort of trained to be inclined to exert more effort by associating effort with incentive. So the question is, given that we kind of know that from experiments and laboratory work and so on, what kind of real-world environmental factors can influence the development of the disposition to exert effort, perhaps with some kind of incentive mechanism in mind? What we're going to focus on is the crucial environmental factor of the parent, the parenting practices, how they influence the child's disposition to exert effort, and in particular, what motivational pathways this parenting effect works through. Okay, so we typically think in the motivation literature in terms of two kinds of types of motivation, right? On the one hand, there's intrinsic motivation. That's basically, I do something because I like doing it for its own sake. On the other hand, there's extrinsic motivation. I do something because I'm given some reward, typically money, could be status as well, of course. We saw in the last presentation, that's quite important. And so these kind of material rewards, or these extrinsic rewards, they kind of work in a sort of typical principal-agent kind of framework, right? So the principal will set up some incentive mechanism, could be a punishment-based one, could be a reward-based one, could be a bit of both, and the agent will kind of respond accordingly. We also know, however, that there is this kind of crowding out effect where providing extrinsic incentives, or providing even more extrinsic incentives, tends to dilute the influence of intrinsic motivation on performance. So there's this sort of interaction going on there between the two kinds of motivation. As I said, we're looking at the role of parents, and in particular, we're looking at two key dimensions within that. We're looking at the role of parental discipline and the role of parental support. Now, both of these parenting practices, discipline and support, they tend to boost performance, and one would therefore assume boost effort. However, they kind of work, obviously, in different ways. So a parent that emphasizes discipline, they're going to emphasize directive communication. You do X, don't do Y. Yeah? They're going to tend to assess the output of behavior. Did you follow the rules? Did you accord to the external standards that we set? And this kind of discipline approach, this tends to prime extrinsic motivation, right? The child is orientated towards this sort of existing incentive framework. So it's very much like this principal-agent kind of structure that I talked about in the last slide. On the other hand, you also have the supportive approach. And this is more about like relational communication, right? So it won't be that the parent so much is saying, do this, do that. They'll be trying to understand the child's needs and interests and so on more so. They'll tend to more appraise the input of behavior rather than seeing what maybe the consequences are, trying to assess what were the child's intentions. And it'll tend to kind of boost self-esteem and autonomy and that kind of things. And self-esteem and autonomy, these are associated with intrinsic motivation, right? So to sum up, you have discipline, which tends to more prime extrinsic motivation, and you have support, which tends to more prime intrinsic motivation. And this is kind of summed up in this, this kind of conceptual model here. So we have parental discipline and parental support, both having positive effects on effort, right? But these positive effects are moderated by the incentives, right? So when material incentives are present, they should enhance the positive effect of parental discipline. On the other hand, when they're present, they should depress the positive effect of parental support, because if you remember, there's this kind of crowding out effect where the provision of incentives kind of tends to reduce the role of parental support. Okay, and talking about effort, we're going to be looking, as some of the other presentations have, at this kind of these two kind of effort outcomes. One is the effort direction, so that's in the context of our experiment, whether they did the task or not in a given round. And the other is effort intensity, and that's how hard they tried, how many correct answers they got in a given round. Okay, the analytic strategy. We exclude a tournament round here. We've got up to 8 observations per child. Dependent variables, direction is tasking, intensity is correct answers, as I said. Independent variables, these are our measures of parenting practice. So we have parental discipline. Basically, the child was basically asked, you know, how strict are your parents? And they answered on a scale from 1 being not very strict to 4 being very strict. And then we measure parental support, which was basically measured in the same way, where they were kind of asked how supportive their parent was, and they answered on a scale of 1 to 4, from 1 being not very supportive to 4 being very supportive. And crucially, to test this kind of moderating role of incentives, we interact the parenting variables with incentive. We have a vector of controls, which we can talk about if you like. And we have this multi-level model set up with observations nested in children, nested in classrooms. Okay, so results. Okay, so we have this coefficient plot here. And I'd like to direct your attention to the panel A, the left-hand graph. So we have 3 models here. Model 1, this is just a sort of base model without any controls. That's basically regressing effort on parental practices. Model 2, that's the orange dots. This is model 1 plus controls, so no interaction. The model 3, that's where we bring in the interaction between parenting practices and the incentive condition. Okay, so basically, if we look at the first 2 models, these are non-interactive models, we can see that there's no, for panel A, for effort direction, there's no association between parental discipline and effort direction. However, when we introduce incentives in model 3, we see that this interaction kind of emerges, where in the intrinsic condition, there's a negative association between parental discipline and tasking. So when there are no incentives, kids whose parents are more disciplinary, they're less likely to do the task. However, when incentives are brought in, then there's a positive interaction, right? As will be expected by the theory. Now, when it comes to parental support, already in Model 1 and Model 2, these are the non-interactive conditions. We see that there's this positive association between parental support and effort direction. So generally speaking, the more supportive the parents are, the more likely the kids are to do the task. And we also see, however, that there's this negative interaction down at the bottom there between the incentive condition and parental support. So as was kind of expected by the theory, when incentives are introduced, the positive association between parental support and effort is decreased. That was effort direction. Now in panel B, we have effort intensity. I won't go through that in too much detail, except to point out that there's this more or less positive effect across conditions, depending on the models, not always statistically significant at the 5% level. There's a positive association between discipline and effort intensity, right? Correct answers in the tasks. And that's just a general association. There's no interaction between parental discipline and incentive conditions, and generally speaking, there's just no association between parental support and effort intensity. Okay, this is the same stuff in marginal effects plots. We can maybe go into this in the question and answers if you're interested. Also, we were interested in kind of, you know, obviously this is kind of observational stuff. So we kind of wanted to see, okay, not be too agnostic and say, well, you know, there's a positive effect, but who knows, it could be driven by just emitted variable bias. What we did was we basically implemented this kind of robustness analytic check that was outlined by Emily Oster in this paper from 2019. I won't go into the details, but the basic idea is that you know, when you start controlling for various covariates, you tend to see that the coefficient of interest tends to shrink a bit, right? But you also have an increase in the R squared. So the basic idea is, okay, let's kind of imagine that we are actually able to observe the variables we can't observe, right? The omitted variables, and let's see what happens as we keep shrinking that coefficient, but increasing the R squared towards some maximum upper bound. It's kind of a counterfactual way to try and get a handle on how robust the effects might be to omitted variable bias. And without going into too much detail, right now anyway, we basically find that the kind of the headline results, they're robust to omitted variable bias, at least using this method. Okay, so in summary, when we look at effort direction, so the decision to task, we find that support is generally positively associated with effort, but there's a negative interaction with incentives. On the other hand, parental discipline is positively associated with the presence of material incentive. On the other hand, when we look at intensity, so that's the correct answers in the tasks, what we see is that there's just a generally positive association between parental discipline and effort intensity. And there's just no interaction there with incentives. And then when it comes to parental support, we just don't see any association at all. I didn't really go into this in detail earlier on, but we can kind of distinguish between effort direction and effort intensity in terms of this like fast versus slow thinking framework. Yeah, effort direction, this is a kind of a deliberate decision you're making. So it's kind of more like a slow thinking or deliberative kind of cognitive process. Whereas effort intensity is less of a deliberate decision. It's more like a moment-to-moment instinctual kind of cognitive process. What we seem to find here in some is that parenting practices, they affect the kind of the slow thinking processes, the deliberative processes. They don't seem to affect the fast thinking processes so much. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, William. So we have a long lunch break, so we will also take here the 5 minutes time for discussion. Please, could we have the mic here and the other one then with Juan in the first row, and the other one with Juan in the...
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. I was wondering if, it's a clarification question. How did you define disciplined and supporting parents? Because as I understand, you ask these questions if your parents are strict or supportive to every child, right? And they could be both as well, right? Like strict but also supportive. I'm just not sure if these are a complete opposite of each other.
No, they're not. Well, no, and I don't think we would say that or imply that. And you know, some parents can be both, right? And so there's literature, for example, associated with Baumrind, Diana Baumrind, where she argues that basically the best kind of parents are both. There's this interaction between discipline and support. What we find, I don't show it here, we don't find there's any such interaction for our case. So it seems that this kind of interaction is more when it comes to like mental health and psychology variables, and not so much for this kind of effort stuff.
And is that how you categorized the parental support and discipline? If the parents are strict but not supportive, then the discipline?
No, it was possible for them to be both, right? So,
Okay.
you could have parents who were supportive and high discipline. So
Okay.
they were two different variables. So it wasn't that if you were low discipline, you were high support, or vice versa.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So you took it additively, but she asked for an interaction.
Yeah, so as I said, we did the interaction and it didn't.
Yes, I mean, thanks for the presentation. I have two questions. The first one is about the measurement of discipline and support. I don't know if I got it right, but you mentioned that it was self-reported by the students. So,
Yeah.
You can elaborate a bit more about the measurement error of that kind of question? I think it was only one question. So, this is the first question. And the second one is about if you consider also discipline on support at school level. I think you mentioned that there was a multi-level estimation, so maybe if you control by maybe different classes or schools, they have different practices also in terms of support and discipline. Yeah.
So on the first one, yeah, so there's obviously a bit of, let's say, social demand bias there, right? Maybe some kids don't want to say their parents are very harsh, right? So that will tend to, and we see that, we see that the discipline distribution is very much shifted towards the not very strict kind of part of the distribution. That will tend to basically that will kind of tend to weaken the effect, right? Because there's a bit of a measurement error there, basically. So, yeah, but presumably still correlated, right? So let's say you're not going to say your parents very strict, even if they are, but you might say they're quite strict. On the second question, that's a good point. So it would sort of help to conceptually replicate our work if we could also show that the schools that emphasize discipline very much, we have the same kind of effect, right? That would be nice, but I don't believe that we have that, but something to double check and think about for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was very interesting. So you said that supportive parents and incentives has a negative effect. What is your implication on that result? So this is really interesting, but I also, yeah, now thinking about what does it mean a little bit, like implications.
Sorry, what did you say? Supportive parents have a negative effect?
Yeah, with incentives. Yeah, so should supportive parents not use incentives, or are incentives not necessary? So these are kind of thoughts that I have.
So to be precise, it's still positive. It's just less positive, right? So for effort direction, when there are no incentives, it's a fairly steep slope. And then when the incentives are brought in, the slope on support goes almost level. So it's like this crowding out effect, where intrinsic motivation seems to matter less.
And then we have one.
Thank you very much. So my comment is very general, but I was wondering, what do you think about this? I think it's the question for the team, effort team. I mean, while we discuss effort, we well, we, not me, but I was thinking about what about curiosity? So, and especially if effort is relevant for educational achievement and in the classroom, curiosity is very important thing, right? So what is your thought about this? Like, so this, like, experiment is completely free from this curiosity component, right? If, because it makes a huge difference, I guess. If the task is interesting for me, then I will, well, do it. If not, so I mean intellectual curiosity, not like just materially incentivized.
Basically, you mean that sometimes tasks are intrinsically interesting, not like adjusting a slider and so on. Yeah, that's a good point. So one thing we could say is, okay, if the tasks were interesting, we would see the same pattern of results. It's just they would try harder. We could speculate that, right? Another thing to speculate could be that there's some reason to believe theoretically that the crowding out of intrinsic motivation is reversed when tasks are interesting, right? So sometimes we have this crowding out effect where bringing in material incentives reduces the association of intrinsic motivation with performance. But in some contexts, it could be the reverse. It's you have people who are already very interested, let's say elite sports people, and now you're bringing in status, now you're bringing in material incentives, and then they go crazy. They're like, oh, I really have to do this. So it's certainly possible that actually we would see this crowding out effect reversing if we had more intrinsically interesting tasks. We could speculate that.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I guess one thing we could check is the variety of the choices that students make, because we have 2 different games and then there's different tasks. So I guess we could kind of tap into it as a further kind of outcome that lies a bit orthogonal to the vertical effort dimension. So thanks for the idea.
But maybe you also have asked the kids how they like the day, because I mean we talk about 10th graders, 10-year-olds. For them, the slider test and all these things, and coming to the university or interacting with researchers, I mean that is something different than having a lab experiment with students. I mean, so I think the curiosity, and maybe you have a question on judging this. I also want to make one comment. You don't have to answer, but I was, when I listened to the talk, I also had, for me, the connection between the parenting practices and the test performance, it's a long way to go. Because it's, I mean, the parents are not present. It's not about teaching. It's not about school, etc., etc. So I guess you do have a story for it, but I think you need to connect. How could a parenting practice influence the results in your lab? Right? I mean, that's you can answer in 2 minutes, but it's just more for writing up the paper. And the very final comment from Madeline, and then we go for lunch.
Just to chime in too, I think, like in terms of this curiosity question, this is really loud.
It's on.
We do have like need for cognition, which is sort of, I think, could be argued as a sort of intellectual curiosity. These questions are asked like, I like exercises that make me think a lot. I like challenges that I need to think about, and these are cognitive tasks. So you do see a lot of these correlations with effort or how we're measuring it. Actually, in a majority of them, we see need for cognition as a significantly predictive. And I think maybe related to Heike's point, like I think exploiting these personality traits could be really useful. I think personality is very much shaped too by parents. I mean, this is a whole other discussion, but I mean, maybe it's another avenue that you could look into more of trying to draw these connections a bit more. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madeline, for reminding us that we have further data to look into. Also, just to maybe follow up on like further questions that were made about birth order and preschool attendance. We collected data on both, so we can actually also address these questions in our analysis.